never updates the information properly. Yeah, okay. Chapter 5. Divination from the Actions of Birds. That's an O, okay. Oliver walked Ceres to the lantern's house's main door and remained with her as she buttoned her coat against the chill. The sky was clear, the crescent moon hanging so low over an old house to the east that one almost might have stood on its roof and touched a hand to a dead world. "What is this place?" said Ceres. "Is it part of the center?" "Of a sort," said Oliver. "Years ago a writer lived there. He wrote just one Is this are they gonna mention it? They're gonna mention the book? Oh what? Alright, what if I did this? You know? I know it works. Just have it laying on the Switch dock. "What is that place?" said Ceres. "Is it part of the center?" Of a sort," said Oliver. "Years ago a writer lived there. He wrote just one book that became famous, published under a pseudonym. He made some money from it, but he didn't have a happy life." "No?" "His wife died in childbirth, along with her baby. He never married again. He just sat in that house, wrote his novel, and lived modestly on the proceeds. Towards the end of his life, he founded a charity with earnings from the book, as well as money he left to him by his father, which he never spent. His father was a codebreaker at Bletchley Park during the war, and afterward invented something to do with computers and coding that made him quite healthy. The money paid for the initial purchase of the land for the Lantern House, and much of its construction. The interest from the fund still contributes to our upkeep along with the royalties, because the book continues to sell, which enables us to provide care for those without the ability to pay." "When did he die?" asked Ceres. She had a vague recollection of all this, a passing reference by her mother or father, after she had left home, only to be discarded as inconsequential. "He didn't exactly." "What?" said Oliver. "I mean, he's certainly dead now, but technically he disappeared and may even be listed as missing in some police file. What happened was what happened. Whatever whatever happened, he was a fading, elderly man when he vanished, and that was almost 20 years ago." When the first book came out. "There's always talk of turning the house into another wing of the center, or giving it over to office space, but parts of it are particularly old, and subject to all kinds of restrictions on what alterations can or can't be made. At first the trustees tried to rent it out, but nobody wanted to stay there for long, and then it was briefly opened to the public as a museum. It was just too much trouble to keep it running. After it was used for file storage, now it's vacant. The floorboards are rotten and there are holes in the roof, but the charity money can be put to better use here, and no one else wants to spend what's required to renovate it. I guess it makes sense. You have the money for helping people in need, and you don't want to be using it for keeping that place up and running. That small little area. Even by moonlight, Ceres could tell that it had once been an impressive residence. It might be so again if someone were willing to invest in it. Why didn't nobody want to live there? She said. She had picked up on the hesitancy in Oliver's voice. Old houses and all that, he said. You know what some people are like. No, tell me, what are some people like? Oliver examined his shoes and tried to make light of what he said next. They claimed it was haunted, so they didn't want to stay. 3 leases were broken before everyone gave up on it. Haunted? You mean by ghosts? Or by memories, which may be the same thing. Not good ones either. Why do you say that? Because if they were all good. Because if they were good, all those people wouldn't have upped and left, would they? I'd better be getting back inside before someone starts thinking I've run away with the fairies. Have you been inside the house? Once or twice. And? I didn't linger. He was serious now. It didn't feel quite empty. As Oliver prepared to return to his duties, Sirius asked one last question. What was the name of the novel? What was the name of the novel? The one that paid for this place. It's called The Book of Lost Things. Dude, it was. That's crazy. That's nuts. I mean, yeah. It makes sense because the way you end the first book, you can't just make a second book and kind of like, uh, but the way the first book ended, how do you just make a second book? It's called The Book of Lost Things, said Oliver. Actually, I thought you might have read it. Why would you say that? Because it has a crooked man in it, just like your story. No, I don't think I've heard of it. Or him. Well, said Oliver, you have now. Nearing her car, Ceres saw that a rough path wound east through the woods from the parking area. She wondered if it led to the house. Not that she had any plans to go visiting at this hour. She might not have believed in ghosts, but she'd read enough mysteries to know that bad things could happen to a person who chose to wander the woods at night. I'm looking at you, the watcher, like freaking movie watcher. And Milton Keynes and his environs were not immune to crime. Even a wicked witch might stand a good chance of being mugged in the wrong stretch of forest. On the lowest branch of an oak tree that marked the entrance to the path, she spied movement, an old rook with one eye, the other lost to talons. What? No, said Ceres. It's not possible. You can't have followed us here. The bird croaked 3 times, a response uncannily like laughter, keeping her distance. Ceres leaned down and commenced gathering stones. I'll show you what happens to rooks that think they've found easy prey, she said. I'll make sure you wish that whatever took that eye had some back and finished the job. But when she looked up, the rook had departed. I wait, I don't remember that. Talked about a bird already? Oh wow, we're on chapter 6 already. That was literally 2 pages. Huh. Chapter chapter Oliver tells Sirius about the old house. Author lived there. Famous author of book of lost things. That was, man, that ending is so meta. I get it. I get it. But it's just like, man. Because the book that you're reading isn't the book he wrote. Because it literally talks about how he ended his life. And it's something about birds. But I did not go into that. Chapter 6 Twilight or Owl Light. Siri slept late the next morning. She did not dream, or if she did, she had no memory of the substance. She spent the hours that followed unpacking boxes of clothing and books, among them her daughter's possessions. Phoebe had her own bedroom at the cottage, which already contained some of her things, but now Sirius added the rest, even putting Phoebe's posters and pictures of their former London flat. She could not bear to leave the room unfinished, because to have done so would have been to admit that her faith in the possibility of her daughter's recovery might be wavering. Perhaps, too, there was an element of superstition involved, as though even by hinting at such an outcome she might bring to pass. The cottage was modestly sized, but with a considerable back garden, currently overgrown and distinguished by a stand of old yew trees at its northern extreme that is shared with a small cemetery fallen into disuse since the end of the 19th century. Sirius supposed that some might have found the nearest of a graveyard unsettling or depressing, but she never had. Growing up, she had felt that it was part of the landscape, an occasionally thrilling one, as at Halloween, but otherwise an element that barely registered, because those laid to rest in it had some God, I cannot read this. Because those laid to rest in it had come from the poorest sections of the local community. It contained a few headstones, and someone unacquainted with its history might have passed it by without registering its purpose. The faintest outline of a face formed from the leaves, a green man, peered from one of the old gateposts, testaments to the beliefs older than Christianity. By the northern edge of the graveyard ran a small stream which her father used to claim concealed a water horse and a river sprite, and Sirius might be able to spot them if she stayed still long enough. But Sirius had never seen either horse or sprite, and came to suspect that her father invented their habitancy as a means of keeping her occupied when he wanted to read or watch football. To the east, the stream wound past a hillock, said by some to be a fairy mound, but it was once thought that fairies made their dwellings close to cemeteries to claim the souls of those laid to rest. Her father had always been dismissive of this, if only because, in his views, it meant putting the cart before the horse. The mounds were older than human burial places, and therefore it was men unconsciously who chose to situate graveyards close to mounds, not vice versa. On the other hand, he was scornful of those who, out of caution, stepped around mushroom rings, ascribing their presence to the actions of fairies. As he explained to Ceres, the fungal threads sprouted in a circular shape underground. This was science, and there was no mystery about it. On such esoterica were articles for folklore journals built. Okay, so her father ain't very superstitious about things. Get it. Okay. It was the trees that Ceres especially loved. They were known as walking yews, formed when the branches of a parent trunk reached the ground and formed when the branches of a parent trunk reached the ground, then layered and extended themselves to produce new roots, as well as interesting archways and grottos first. And grottos for first Ceres, then Phoebe, to explore, which regrew as siblings. Benignly neglected, the yews continue to thrive, evergreen, their branches sleeved in lichen. Their bark, upon closer examination, not brown alone, but red, green, and purple too. Lovely and dangerous also, full of poison taxine, used in the past to lace the tips of arrows, so that even a scratch might prove fatal. And so local lore had it, once applied to the stems and thorns of a bunch of freshly cut roses, which were sent by a baker's daughter to a rival in love, who subsequently perished in agony. It's a pretty harsh way to kill someone. Pretty elaborate way to kill someone, actually. Returned to her childhood home under the worst circumstances, Ceres discovered a new comfort in the proximity of the yews. Because they endured, damaged, scarred, blighted, they persisted. They declined to yield to death. Even in Nostoc, which her mother abhorred, gave Ceres hope. Currently in residence on the garden bench, the blue-green algae, brown in its spore from the cemetery, formed clear glutinous clumps across the lawn and furniture. Okay, hold up. What if I move it here? Let me adjust my glasses. So I can actually read this. Returned to her childhood home under the worst circumstances, Ceres discovered a new comfort in the proximity of the yews. Because they endured, damaged, scarred, and blighted, they persisted. They declined to yield to death. Even the nostoc which her mother abhorred gave Ceres hope. Currently in residence on the garden bench, the blue-green algae, brown in spores from the cemetery, formed clear glutinous clumps across the lawn and furniture after rain. On one level, Ceres accepted it was undeniably disgusting, but on the other, it was tenacious, resilient. Nostoc could remain in a dry, seemingly lifeless state for years, or decades, only to revive again at a time of nature's choosing. Her mother, had she been present, would have sliced it away with a hose, but Ceres chose to leave it unbothered. When she grew weary of resettlement chores, she drove to a supermarket to stock the larder and refrigerator before, on a whim, going book shopping, something she hadn't done much of since the accident. She and Phoebe were inveterate browsers, although they preferred older second-hand bookshops to newer ones, assuming one could still find any of the former open. Charity stores have absurd. Then again, even when used bookstores were ubiquitous, Series had Series had often wondered if part of their purpose was to be closed as often as possible, just in case someone should come in and disturb their study disorder by actually buying a book. Used booksellers' ploys were legion. Back in 5 minutes signs that remained in place for hours or days, a scribbled phone number to be called in order to gain entry, but destined never to be picked up, assuming it had ever been connected in the first place, and once carefully typed on a line card, the 5 words, closed due to death temporarily, which raised more questions than it answered, not least whether it was the closure or the death that was intended to be provisional. In the snug, nearby Olney's children's bookshop, she bought the only copy of The Book of Lost Things on the shelves. Since Phoebe was a beneficiary of the writer's largus generosity in bestowing largesse. Huh. Since Phoebe was a beneficiary of the writer's largesse, Ceres supposed that she should know more about her benefactor's work, having learned more about his life from the internet. As Oliver has explained, it was one colored by sadness, but not defined by it. The author had found a way to turn his pain into a novel, and that novel had occasionally helped others with their pain. That was what the stories did, or the ones that mattered to us. They helped us to understand others, but they could also make us feel understood in turn, and less alone in the world. Right now, Ceres thought she would be happy with that, because she never felt more alone. But she remained troubled by the tale of the 2 dancers that had transmitted itself seemingly unconsciously. I would be very concerned. I'd be like, what did I just read to my child, and what did I write down? Like, I just don't remember writing it down? It's kind of nuts. That had transmitted itself, seemingly unconsciously, from mind to mouth to hand, and from there to the page. Had it not been in her own writing, she might have doubted it was her work at all. Typically, when she wrote longhand, she left a trail of crossed-out words, rethinks, and corrections. When she was contemplating the right turn of phrase or the construction of a sentence, she had a habit of tapping the end of a pencil or pen on the paper, creating a swarm of dots. By contrast, the writing of the previous night was word perfect and showed no signs of hesitation or reflection. Upon her return to the cottage, Ceres brewed a pot of tea and spent a few hours at her desk. She had forced herself to begin working again, and already had 3 deadlines imminent, all involving advertising copy for products she would not have wanted to buy or websites she wouldn't wish to visit, which made the task of convincing others to do that much more difficult. Then again, she had only consented to write about products she liked, she and Phoebe would have ended up on the if she had only consented to write about products she liked, she and Phoebe would have ended up on the streets long ago. That was one of the differences between childhood and adulthood. As a child, you often had to do things you didn't want to, including, in Phoebe's case, go to school, finish homework, and eat broccoli, because someone bigger and older told you to do them. As an adult, you still had to do things you didn't want to do, but if you were fortunate, somebody paid you to do them, which helped a bit. Not wrong. You get paid to do something, or as a child, you just got to eat those broccolis, you know? Once the work was completed and the day was mellowing into evening, Ceres allowed herself a glass of wine to accompany her reading of The Book of Lost Things. It had been a long time she had opened a work of fiction of her own for her own pleasure. Mostly she read for Phoebe, even before the accident, and now she found it hard to associate the act with anyone but her daughter. Not to be reading aloud felt odd to Ceres, so much so that it took her a moment to realize. She could hear herself reciting the opening of the novel to the empty room, like a spell or incantation. Once upon a time. Who even began a book that way anymore? Ah, no. There was that sudden sharp sting of loss again, as she caught herself using one of her daughter's favorite sentence constructions. A formulation on which Phoebe fell back when something was particularly frustrating or bewildering. Who even knows that song? Who Who even knows that song? When even was that? What even is cauliflower? God, she missed the sound of Phoebe's voice so much. It was the quiet that was so hard to hear, so hard to bear. As though Ceres was gradually being prepared for a lasting silence to come, when she would no longer even have her daughter's breathing to console her, and a reminder that she remained in the world. But how to balance this with the despair that descended on her more frequently and most acutely in the hoary light before full dawn, come although it had also come upon her as she drove home from the lantern house that night before, the secret wish that this would all just come to an end, a resolution for her, or for Phoebe. No! She shouted the word to the empty room, startling herself. I take it back. I didn't mean that. To the dust motes caught in the lamplight. I will not part with her, not like this. Whatever it takes, I want her to return to me. The crumbs on the plate and the spilled tea in the saucer. She is my child. To the spiders in the corners, surrounded by the shriveled discards of the quarry. Are you listening? To the woman in the shadows who only... What? To the woman in the shadows who heard only what she wanted to hear. Mm, that's pretty sad. She definitely regrets saying anything of like wanting to give up, feeling tired of all this, right? She says that, right? In chapter 5? I don't think I can keep doing this. Yeah, that's it. That's what she said. Cemeteries. Buys Book of Lost Things. Regrets. Feeling. Like, she's giving up it to the empty room. And Woman in Shadow? Oh, dude, don't tell me the woman in the shadow is like actually her daughter or something. Chapter 7 Mystery. It was dark, and the book had been set aside in favor of the nightly news, which turned out to be an error given that it was dominated by Russian tanks bombarding villages and scientists prophesying imminent climate catastrophe. Before the accident, the latter had particularly troubled Phoebe, who couldn't understand why politicians weren't rushing to save the planet. It had been left to Ceres to try to explain that. Rather like some small children, politicians were driven by short to medium-term gain, and rarely thought further than the next election, which only confirmed Ceres' view that the politics was no proper pursuit for an adult. She gave up on the news bulletin after only 10 minutes. She didn't need to be made to feel more impotent. She stroked the cover of the back. She stroked the cover of the Book of Lost Things, as she might have a sleeping cat. Although she didn't like to admit it to herself, Ceres realized she'd become distant from fiction, so much so that she could no longer use it as a form of escape, and she had more cause than most to want to leave reality behind, if only for a while. She couldn't even blame her disengagement on the accident, because it had been ongoing since adolescence. She had fallen out of love with the stories, and what had come upon Phoebe simply confirmed the pointlessness of them. What good were they? The happy ones were untrue to life, and the sad ones couldn't tell you anything you didn't already know. Here is my story. I had a daughter once, but she was stolen from me, and left in her place was a doll in her image. Yet, the book on the table was calling to her, wanting to be read. She thought it might be because of its connection to the Lantern House, to the author's old residence rotting away on the grounds, and the mystery of his disappearance. These things gave texture to the tale. They made it more relevant, and so it was less the book than the circumstances surrounding its creation that engaged her. This is what she told herself, even as she caught the lie lurking. It was peculiar, but everything about the experience of reading this novel now made her perplexed. Earlier she had found herself becoming immersed in it without noticing, and when at last she surfaced, she was shocked to find that nearly 2 hours had gone by. So lost as she had been in the story, a boy who loses his mother, gains an unwanted stepmother and half-brother, and ventures into a land, real or imaginary, that was never clear. Built from the books on his shelves and the fairy stories that he loves, in its pages dwelt the crooked man, a man whose a man, the crooked man, a being who, as Oliver had pointed out, bore the same name as the monster in the story she had invented for Phoebe. The only explanation Ceres could come up with was that in the past she must have read a review of the book or an article about its author and stored those details away from her mind. away in her mind. She set out making she set about making supper, even though she was not particularly hungry. Her pleasure in food, like her pleasure in so many things, had been taken from her. She ate only to sustain herself, whatever little use she was to Phoebe at present. She would be no use to her at all if she ended up in the hospital herself due to neglect. After supper, she read some more of the book, taking her more than halfway through. Taking her more than halfway through, when she could read no more. Ceres, called her mother, who now lived modestly in northern Spain for much of the year, and rarely went to bed before 2 in the morning. She left England not long after after Ceres' father had died. She couldn't face a grim winter there without him by her side. She said, but then it turned out that she didn't want to face the English spring or autumn without him. Although she could about that helps a lot more if I move my glasses down because I'm looking down. She couldn't face the grim winter there without him by her side. She said that she said, but then it turned out that she didn't want to face the English spring or autumn without him either, although she could just about tolerate the summer for a few weeks. They had explored the countryside together, she and he, mapping old burial mounds, photographing stone circles and fairy forts, and gathering folk tales, myths, even colorful old and local words to add texture to the obscure academic papers that father published, or to chapters in books destined to be read only by peculiar men and women as obsessive as he, or so Ceres had always assumed. All those yellowed pages, those withered leaves. It had taken a long time for Ceres to figure out why her father's vocation had alienated her so, and the Book of Lost Things reminded her of the reason. She found the stories he preferred frightening. She could see the ghost of him now, sitting in his favorite chair by the empty fireplace, his cardigan smelling of earth and tobacco smoke. There is another England, Ceres, a hidden land, a secret commonwealth, and these tales are its echoes, its history. But she did not care to listen to those echoes. They spoke of cruelty and viciousness. Let them fade away, let them be lost forever. As though to spite him, she had chosen instead to read what she pointedly called her fairy tales. Wait. Okay. But she did not care to listen to those echoes. They spoke of cruelty and viciousness. They let them fade away, let them be lost forever, as though despite him, she had chosen instead to read what she pointedly called her fairy tales, a term that always made her father wince, and the prettier the princess, and the happier the ending, the better. Fairy godmothers, fairy helpers, benevolent beings with wings and wands. She adored them all. But those are not fairies, Ceres, he would tell her. They're good fairies. There's no such thing, because you only believe in bad ones. There's no such thing as bad fairies either. But if they're good and not bad, what are they? They're other, Ceres. That's what they are, other. And his voice was firm and full of conviction, as of one who believed in the objective reality of and his voice was firm and full of conviction, as of one who believed in the objective reality of such creatures, because he did believe. For her father, the past and present ran alongside each other, largely on parallel lines, but they touched in ancient places where they where the land held memories, the way graveyards stored bodies. Those memories crept into earth and stone, metal and wood, infusing inanimate materials with their essence. Around such locales, myths and legends gathered, and out of them came stories, books, histories, so that the boundary between what was real and unreal became more and more obscured. As each teller extracted layers of meaning and added new layers of their own, actuality became shadowy, smudged, and so the world was altered. Because her father would tell her, once a book or story was told for the first time, reality itself shifted. The story became part of the world, and anyone who heard it or read it, in whom it took in, and in whom it took root, was never the same again. Stories were a benign infection, transforming their hosts were generally benign because some books could reshape people for the worse. Pure enough venom into a book, or warp truth sufficiently in its pages, and you could turn a weak mind hateful. It's not wrong. I mean, people are easily influenced by media, right? Not just books, but I mean, it can be books. It could be stories about anything. People will believe it. But the more one read, and the wider one's readings, the, but the, but the more one read, and the wider one's reading, the stronger one's mind became. This is why, this was why, in the end, her father was content that his daughter consumed any books at all, even if they weren't always the ones of which he approved. What mattered was that she appreciated the value of literature. When some idiot politician or finger-wagging do-gooder complained about the books on school reading lists because they dared to treat adolescents with respect or acknowledge the issues of race, sexuality, and gender might be some relevance to them as they strode the path to adulthood, he would always make the same remark. It's not the people who read books you have to worry about, but the people who don't. Meanwhile, the phone was still ringing in Siri's ear. Her mother was forever darting off to some other part of her house, or wandering in the garden, day or night, leaving her phone wherever she last dropped it. Frequently, she would mute it so that she wouldn't be disturbed while reading or watching TV, and forget to turn it back on, leaving Sirius to wonder if she might not have died since their last conversation. And her body was waiting to be discovered by a worried neighbor or some unfortunate postman. Sirius had reached that age when a person spends a great deal of time worrying about both children and parents. Adulthood, she had long ago surmised, was very overrated. At last, her mother picked up. She had returned to England to be with Ceres in the days following Phoebe's accident, and ended up staying for some weeks until it became clear that the granddaughter's condition was unlikely to change dramatically for the time being. But then, mother and daughter had grown fractious with each other because Ceres' flat was too small for a pair of adults to share, particularly adults who were probably too much alike in some ways for comfort, yet also too dissimilar in others. Ceres loved her mother, but she had a big personality, and big personalities didn't function well in restricted spaces. Eventually, by mutual agreement, Ceres' mother returned to Spain, but they spoke at least every other day, and Ceres knew that she would be ready to hop on a plane back to England at a moment's notice should anything happen to. No, nothing would happen to Phoebe, or nothing worse. Ceres willed it. The new environment of the Lantern House, with its trees and flowers and birdsong, could only be beneficial. If Phoebe's spirit remained in that body, it might hear the birds and respond, and if it was elsewhere, their song could yet summon it back. Ceres just had to keep up her own spirits. Ceres just had to keep her own spirits up. Man, why do I do that? And not fall prey to melancholy or despair, as she did earlier. How is she? How is she? Asked her mother, because that was how their conversations inevitably began. The same. The same, said Ceres. But the new place is lovely, or as lovely as it can be. Are you missing London? I haven't had the chance to miss. Haven't had a chance to miss it, but I don't think I will. London had become too big and loud and empty without Phoebe. She had filled its spaces. I hate to say it, Ceres continued, but you may have been right all along about coming back here. It was always home for me. I've forgotten how much I love it. They had sometimes discussed selling the cottage, but it was filled with possessions and memories from decades of married life. Her mother was reluctant to part with any of them. Also, no pressing financial reason had existed for the sale, or not until Phoebe's condition threatened to alter that situation. Ceres' mother had informed her that she need only ask and the cottage would be put on the market, but living in it now appeared to be a better solution, thanks to the lantern house. Well, just be careful that you don't get lonely. And do try to make some new friends, Ceres. Ceres had never minded being alone when she was younger, because there was a difference between being lonely and alone. Ceres had never minded being alone. Ceres had never minded being alone when she was younger. Ceres had never minded being alone when she was younger, because there was a difference between being lonely and alone. Books helped back then, because a person with a good book could never be lonely. Then Phoebe had come along, and Ceres didn't have time to be alone, and was never lonely as long as her daughter was around. I was gonna ask, like, what happened to the father, but then I totally forgot. He left. Deadbeat father left before she was born. I think I don't remember. Because books helped back then, because a person with a good book could never be lonely. Then Phoebe had come along, and Ceres didn't have time to be alone, and was never lonely as long as her daughter was around. But with Phoebe in a state of suspension, Ceres, too, was held in stasis. She was alone and lonely. Something would have been done about it. Something would have to be done about it. Perhaps something already was being done. I've started reading again, she said. Books, I mean. Books aren't the same as friends, aren't they? Dad would have disagreed with you. Your father disagreed with me on many things, which was one of the reasons we got along so well. Because they were unimportant things? No, because secretly we both knew that I was right and he was wrong. He preferred not to admit it, and I was happy to let him have his pride. There was some truth to this, Ceres admitted. Her father was a man who dwelt in many worlds, the real one far from being his best loved. Being his best loved, the presence in it of a wife and daughter notwithstanding. Had her mother not kept him anchored to the ground, he might well have floated away, a distant figure receding into the clouds, his head buried in a history of megalithic circles and underground tombs, or a paper on the differences between dryads and hamadryads. I worry about you, you know, said her mother. I'm concerned about what all this is doing to you. If only you had someone by her side to share the load. This was another of her mother's frequent tunes. She couldn't grasp why Ceres remained single. Okay, I see. I thought she was just asking if you need help. Bro, what? Stop being single so you cannot so you have to deal with this alone. Bruh. Or I guess that's why she wants her to make friends at the same time. I want to read that sentence again. Books had helped her back then, because a person with a good book could never be lonely. Then Phoebe had come along, and Ceres didn't have time to be alone, and was never lonely as long as her daughter was around. But with Phoebe in a state of suspension, Ceres too was held in stasis. She was alone and lonely. Something would have to be done about it, perhaps already being done. I worry about you, said her mother. I'm concerned about what this is all doing to you. If only you had someone by your side to share the load. This was another of her mother's frequent tunes. She couldn't grasp why Ceres remained single, and Ceres would have struggled to explain, even had she wanted to. She had been let down badly by Phoebe's father, which was part of it. This had made her not mistrusting men, but wary of them, especially with a young daughter to consider. She didn't want to introduce a new man to Phoebe's life just because she occasionally missed male company, or the bed was too big, or so far she hadn't met any man about whom she felt sufficiently deeply to consider allowing him in. But it was also the case that she and Phoebe had become their own unit. They had established routines and patterns that worked, and with which both of them were content. Ceres hadn't wanted anyone else to disrupt this, not unless she was absolutely certain it was the right person. And since that was difficult, even impossible, to know, she had settled for a life without a partner. It wasn't always easy, but she was content with the decision she had made, or had been, until the accident. A boyfriend, you mean? Just someone, said her mother. I might get a dog. A dog isn't someone, it's something. But now that you come to mention it, a dog might not be such a bad idea. You can talk to it, and it won't talk back. Like Dad, you mean? Your dad didn't remotely resemble a dog. He wouldn't have dreamed of doing what he was told, even for the promise of his biscuit. It was hardly enough to get him to remember what he was supposed to buy if I asked him to go to the shops. I used to wait by the phone for him to get. I used to wait. I lost. Where was I? I used to wait by the phone for him to call once he had arrived, checking on what it was I wanted him to get. I'd have blamed him. I'd have blamed it on senility. Yeah, like senile. Except he was sharp as a tack right to the end. However much he might have pretended otherwise, and there was no point in giving him a list because he always left it behind, or somehow misplaced it in an overstuffed pocket. I did once consider writing things on his hand, but to be honest, I wouldn't have put it past him to have lost a hand somewhere between the front and the end of the street. He was the most infuriating man, and I loved him with all my heart. Ceres let her gaze roam over the living room of the cottage. There was so much of her father here. The books, the maps, the woodcuts on the walls, his armchair, even a couple of his pipes in a rack on the mantelpiece, along with a stuffed platypus in a glass case. He claimed not to be able to remember buying the platypus, which had shown up on the mantelpiece while Siri's mother was in the hospital for the removal of gallstones, and refused to part with it upon her return, arguing that it added character to the room. What an odd, a very specific odd thing to mention in that book. By the way, here's the platypus. I guess it just adds more to the father being stubborn. Yet she loved him. Nooks in the brickwork were still frosted with wax from the candles he would light up, and the shelves in the halls were filled with pieces he had found in the earth during the explorations and excavations. Viking stone-carved animals, Saxon arrowheads, shards of Roman pottery, even jewelry made from semi-precious metals. He had been scrupulous about handing over valuable or uncommon items to the authorities, though he knew they would probably just end up stored in some dusty box in a museum basement. Only one thing he had kept that he should have surrendered: a Roman dodecahedron dating from the 2nd or 3rd century. It was 3 inches in diameter and consisted of 12 pentagonal faces, each with a circular hole in the center. Although the holes were not of the same size, and each face was surrounded by 5 small raised circular knobs. Her father had spotted it in disturbed soil near Hadrian's Wall, the barrier built by the Romans to fortify the south of Britain against the northern tribes, and kept it for himself. The attraction for him lay in the mystery of the object, because no one had yet been able to establish the purpose of a dodecahedron. One theory was that it might have been used for soothsaying, but the dodecahedron bore no symbols or inscriptions, so how could one divine knowledge from it? The knobs meant that it couldn't be thrown easily, so it wouldn't come to rest on the side of which it was dropped. That meant that dodecahedrons didn't work as gaming device either. Some frustrated experts declared them to be purely decorative, but her father had never accepted this. In the end, he stopped reading other people's opinions of the dodecahedron together. We should do that. We should, just make random... Dude. Ancient future civilizations discovering fidget spinners. What could they have been for? Was it an instrument of some kind to measure the distance of... Nah, man, we just played with it. Just a toy. It's not important to know what it's for, he would tell Ceres as she sat on his lap, turning the dodecahedron in her hands. It's enough to know that it is. It's not important to know what it's for. It's enough to know what it is. That it is. Oh. Now, the phone held to one ear, Ceres walked to the hall, the dodecahedron still in its place and still shining. Alone of all the collection, it never gathered dust. She clasped it in her hand. The radar wasn't working, and she could see the breath clouding. She could see her breath clouding. Yet the dodecahedron was warm to the touch. She set it back down. The shelf on which it stood held the books that were most important to her father. Along them, art monographs by Giovanni Battista Piranesi. Okay. Gardner's Oliver Cromwell from 1901, which had been awarded to his own father as a school prize, as all 3 men, Ceres' father, grandfather, and Cromwell, had been born in Huntingdon, Cambridgeshire. 2 volumes of Milton's Paradise Lost, which I regard as the greatest poetical work in English dating from 1719, and 5 small volumes of Livy in Latin, Livy in Latin, bound in red and gold leather, published in Germany in the 19th century. From the latter, Ceres could remember her father translating for her, behind her mother's back, of course, the story of Regulus and the 3rd century BC Roman general paroled by the Carthaginians in order to return to Rome to negotiate a settlement. When he got home, Regulus urged the Roman Senate to reject their offer before against the protests and his own people, returning to Carthage to fulfill the terms of his parole, under which he had promised to go back. First troubles. Carthaginians were reputed to have cut off Regulus's eyelids, packed him in a spiked box, and rolled him around in it until he died. Not unlike the unfaithful servant in the story of the Goose Girl by the Brothers Grimm, one of the folk tales of which her father very much approved, because someone perished painfully at the end. Why did Regulus go back? Ceres asked. Because he had given his word, her father replied, and it was the right thing to do, even if he knew he might be hurt or die. Sometimes that's a choice we have to make. I hope I never have to make that choice. He kissed her head. I hope you never have to make it either. I must go. Oh, Dad, I must go, Ceres told her mother. I'm bone tired. Then go to bed. I love you. If you get a dog, don't make it one of those little yappy ones, or I'll never forgive you. They wished each other good night. Ceres turned off the lights, put a guard in front of what remained of the fire, and climbed the stairs to her bedroom. She didn't pull the curtains on the window because she liked to fall asleep by moonlight in winter, knowing that she wouldn't be woken at some ungodly hour by the rising sun. As it happened, she barely had time to register the unsheathed blade of the moon before she was asleep, and so did not hear the flapping wings of the glass, or notice the tendril of ivy force of its way through the crumbling brickwork of the wall and curl itself quietly, almost watchfully, into a corner. Flapping wings of the glass, tendril ivy force its way through the crumbling brickwork. Okay. That was a lot in that chapter. I guess that was really about continue reading and calls her mother. While describing about her parents' relationship. Dad always wanted series to read. Mother suggesting series makes Friends or finds someone. Guess I should also add sleeps. Wow. Finds crawl through. Chapter 8. Hydrate. Chapter 8. A fear or dread. A lesson had learned. A lesson hard learned as an adult is that no call in the dead of night presages an event to be a sign or warning. A lesson hard learned as an adult is that no call in the dead of night presages any good. So it was that Sirius came awake instantly when her phone rang at 4 a.m. The display showing one word: lantern. Hello? The voice was Oliver's. For this, if nothing else, she was grateful. Sirius, he said. Phoebe's condition had deteriorated. I think you should come. Wow, what a way to wake up. Oh, a condition has deteriorated. Phoebe's new room was different. More like the one in the hospital. There were no pictures on the walls, no armchairs or couches. This was a high dependency unit, designed with one purpose: to keep a child alive. Sirius was trying to listen to what the silver-haired doctor was saying. Beatty? Yes, Beatty, that was her name. But the words drifted by, barely making an impression. Sudden, unexplained, difficulty breathing. Because her attention kept returning to her daughter, Phoebe now looked even smaller and more lost than before. Sirius so badly wanted to hold her, to put her head to her breast and stroke her hair, to tell her everything would be all right, that she needn't be afraid. But if you leave me, I understand if there's too much pain. I want you to let go, but if you can, I want you to stay because I don't want you to be with you. Because I don't want to be without you. Could this have been caused by the stress of the transfer from the hospital? She asked. I very much doubt that, said Mr. Beatty. Beatty? The staff responsible for the move are so experienced that we've never had an incident, not even a minor one. Phoebe was monitored throughout and examined again as soon as she arrived with us. There were no warning signs and no issues. What we continue to hope is that the alteration in her condition may be relayed to a process of repair. Her system had been shutting down all non-essential functions to concentrate on restoring the important ones, and the job is ongoing. But if that's true, said Ceres, how do you explain this turndown? We're pretty confident it's a temporary lapse, but I won't lie to you. We were worried about Phoebe for a while, which is why we thought it'd be best to bring you in. Now we have her stabilized, and she's out of danger, if not out of the woods. Through the unit's sole window, Sirius could see the shapes of the branches taking form in the early morning light, like a photograph slowly developing in a tray. They appeared chimerical to her, intruders from an alien environment. Here was a world of plastic, metal, glass, electronics, and there one wood, bark, grass, and sap. Somehow her daughter straddled both, her body lying unmoving in one while her soul wandered the other. Can I stay here with her? Said Ceres. Not in the unit itself, I'm afraid, although you can take one of the parental suites. We do our best here, but it's not for the Savoy. Savoy? A kind of cabbage in. You might be more comfortable at home, but it's completely your choice. If there's another change, you'll be the first to know, and you can call us at any time to check on her. But as I said, cautiously optimistic. But as I said, we're cautiously optimistic that we've arrested the decline. Ceres could only nod. She wanted to thank she wanted to thank her for what she'd done, but the words couldn't come easily. By the time she found them, the doctor was gone. Only Oliver remained. Together they watched the nurse check on Phoebe. Her movements swift and efficient, no time or effort wasted. Only at the end, as she was leaving, did she pause to stroke Phoebe's hair, and a look of tenderness and understanding was exchanged between nurse and mother. That should be me, thought Ceres. I should be the one to console her. I told you, said Oliver. She's a fighter. No, said Ceres. She's just a child. A child shouldn't have to fight. Not like this. It's not fair. None of it is fair, said Oliver. But it is her battle, and all we can do is aid her in it. There was a movement when he slipped. When she might have But this is her battle, and all we can do is aid her in it. There was a moment when she slipped, when she might have lost, but we were there for her, and the fight goes on. Ceres turned to him. How do you do it, Oliver? She asked. This job of yours, it's so hard. All these children, with all their illnesses. Because it's not a job, said Oliver. Not to me, not to any of us. It's more than that, much more. And I do it because not doing it would be harder, if that makes any sense. Not to be here for them. Not to sit with them in the night when they're scared. Not to be able to explain to them what's happening or why. I couldn't do anything else, not now. Nothing else would have Nothing else would have such meaning. Even at the worst moments, I've never regretted the decision to come here. Never. But I also know what I feel for each of these children, for all their depths is infinitesimal, infinitesimal compared to what you feel for Phoebe and what you're going through now. All I can tell you is that I can understand. Wait, all I can tell you is that I understand it. A fraction. Sirius reached out and held his hand tightly for a moment. I'd like to stay here for a while, she said. Not to watch over her. After that, I know you'll do the same. I'd like to stay here for a while, she said, to watch over her. After that, I know you'll do the same. Yes, said Oliver, I will. And he left her with her child. In the days that followed, that was it for that chapter. That was an interesting one. It was really just a worrying wake up call about babies. condition. The doctors reassure series. Poor series. Oily skin, irritating, holding on envy, on ivy. In the days that followed, a new routine took over Siri's life. Despite the Lantern House's assurances that she would no longer Despite the Lantern House's assurances that she would be notified immediately of any developments, she found that she couldn't relax at the cottage. Her nerves were constantly jangling, one ear always alert for the sound of the phone ringing. She was reminded, too, of her father's death, and how the hospital had called after midnight to say that she could come immediately, because his race was nearly run. Ceres had been staying at the cottage with her mother and Phoebe. Ceres had been staying at the cottage with her mother and Phoebe, who was then not yet 3 years old. Ceres had somehow managed to dress quickly and wrap Phoebe up warmly without waking her, before joining her mother for the 15-minute drive to the hospital. By the time they got there, her father was dead. His hand was still warm as Ceres held it, and all she could think of was, "We should have been here. We should have stayed. We knew he didn't have long. They told us it could be a day or two, but no more than that. Instead, it was just a few hours, and we weren't beside him at the end. He died without us. We didn't even get to say goodbye." While she willed a different ending for Phoebe, one in which her child was restored to her, she feared another. She would not allow Phoebe to be alone if that moment came. She asked the care team if she might be permitted to make use of one of the suites after all, and she was told she was welcome to do so. Suite was too grand of a word for that room, which was just about big enough to accommodate a bed, a desk and a chair, a wardrobe and bedside table, and a tiny bathroom, but it was minutes away from where Phoebe was lying. The room also had a refrigerator, a kettle, and a microwave, as well as a wall-mounted television, so Ceres could make coffee, eat food, and even watch old, undemanding movies when she was tired to do anything else. She was allowed to spend time with Phoebe as well, now she'd been stabilized, so Ceres resumed reading to her daughter, but this time it was The Book of Lost Things that she read rather than the old tales. Even though she had almost finished the novel, she returned to the start and commenced reading aloud from the first chapter, so that Phoebe, too, might know it. "In case you're listening, in case you can hear me." But there was another reason Ceres had left the cottage. One she had not mentioned to anybody, not even her mother: the ivy. She spotted the first of it in the corner of her bedroom, on the evening after Phoebe was placed in intensive care. She climbed on a chair to clip it back with a pair of old shears, and the next day stopped at a garden center to buy a weed killer. The afternoon, she sprayed the exterior wall, as well as the inside corner where the ivy intruded, and plugged the hole with some filler she had discovered in the garden shed. Before returning to the Lantern House, to pay her evening visit to Phoebe. While she awoke the following morning, the ivy had broken through the filler and started to spread, 2 tendrils instead of 1, snaking south to the east from the corner, the leaves no longer entirely green, but I man, when there's a dash and then like continues a word, that screws me up every time. But mottled yellow and white, as though the poison she had sprayed had left it physically altered but otherwise unharmed. She attacked it again with the shears, but it was harder to cut than before, and she had the disturbing impression that it was actively resisting her. Learning from the last assault and adding an extra layer of protection to its stem, she even after them even after she managed to sever the branches, they fought her attempts to wrest them away. And when she finally managed to yank them free, she took a layer of paint and a chunk of plaster with them, disfiguring the wall. Also, despite wearing gloves, Ceres developed a rash on her wrist and fingers, and had to pry green, splinter-like fragments from her flesh. Jesus. But worse was to come. When she went downstairs to find the ivy had entered the kitchen too, devising points of access by the windowsill and from behind the cupboards. These leaves too bore the new coloration. Ceres didn't even wait until the after breakfast, but immediately went outside and began spraying again until the 5-liter container of weed killer was empty. She could only hope that it worked. The prospect of hiring someone to remove the ivy filled her with dread. Apart from the fact that she had always liked how it looked on the cottage, the way it had adhered so tenaciously to the walls of her bedroom suggested that wrenching it from the exterior might damage the stonework. Money was already tight without adding expensive repairs to her outgoings in order to keep the winter chill out, or prevent the cottage from crumbling around her. Lord knew what her mother would have to say about that. Ceres went back inside, made breakfast, and did a couple of hours of work. At noon she drove to the lantern house to read to Phoebe. She left shortly after 2, brought bread, milk, and a newspaper, and was home by 3. She pulled up outside the cottage, got out of the car, and took the bag of groceries back to the and took the bag of groceries from the back seat. Only then did she notice what had happened to the ivy. The gardener's name was Green, which Ceres might have found amusing at the time. Andrahelix, he said, as he stood before the house. English ivy, strong-willed stuff. Once it gets foothold, that's the devil to dig out. But why is it red in places? The ivy on the cottage walls, green for so many years, then briefly tinged with yellow and white, now showed a clear internal structure on its leaves, as though sanguinary fluids, not water and sugar, were flowing through them. Could be a pest infestation, said Mr. Green. Or too little phosphorus in the soil. Sometimes people mistake Boston ivy for English, and Boston reverts to red in autumn. But you don't see Boston ivy so much round here. And this is definitely the homegrown English variety. Note by the leaves. He leaned in closer and took the ivy in the. He leaned in closer and took some of the ivy in his gloved hand. Never seen redness quite like this before, though, he said. It's the midrib and veins that have turned, see? Sears looked, but didn't touch. The ivy repelled her. It looks like blood, she said. Just so. Must have been happening for a while, though. No, it started today. It's not possible, said Mr. Green. Every leaf has changed. That would have taken longer than a day. I'm telling you, it wasn't like this when I left the house earlier. Traces of yellow here and there, yes, but not red. I sprayed it with a weed killer. Could that be the cause? Did you spray a lot of it? Only the front part. Only the front part. The container ran out before I could get to the ivy at the back. But that's red too, said Mr. Green. And the root system is different. No, it's unlikely that weed killer did this. I mean, this ivy's not even dying. If anything, it's flourishing. I want it gone, said Ceres. It's breaking through the walls. Well, I can remove it, although it won't be this week. The next with luck. Next week? By then it might have overrun the house. I'm sorry, but I can't come again any sooner. And I have to warn you, your cottage will look a sight after. You might need to consult a builder too, because I can't promise it won't cause harm to the facade, or worse, if it started to find its way through the stonework. And that was where they left it, Mr. Green promising to do his best to tackle the problem as quickly as he could, and the cottage swathed by ivy with something like blood in its veins. This, then, was the real reason why Ceres had elected to stay at the care home for a time, while she sat by her daughter's bedside, reading, reciting, creating, channeling. This is quite interesting. A very interesting take compared to the first book. Book 2. The Tale of the Man of Ivy. Book 2. Or Tale 2? Story 2? Guess Story 2. The Tale of the Man of Ivy. Once upon a time, in a land both far from this and the very near, because sometimes distant places are closer than you think, and more similar too, lived a man named Jacob. He owned a small farm, but dreamed of owning a larger one. He was married to a pretty wife, but secretly yearned to be married to a more beautiful one. He had a scholarly, a- amiable, having or displaying a friendly and pleasant manner. He had a scholarly, amiable son, but would have preferred a strong, forceful one. These desires Jacob kept to himself, because although he might have been driven by longing for all he did not have, or thought he did not have, because desire is a blinding emotion, he was not a malicious man, and had no wish to hurt his family. Only when he was alone in the woods, with no one to hear, would he permit his frustrations to show. And when he would give vent to his true feelings, speaking aloud of them to bark, branch, and blade. One autumn day, when he spent an hour telling nature of his longing, he heard a voice call his name. He looked around, but the forest clearing was empty. Not even a bird hovered, nor did the tiniest of insects trouble the dirt. Who's there? Said Jacob. Stop hiding and show yourself. Look closer, said the voice, and then you will see. Look to the trees. And Jacob did as the voice told him, first gazing up at the crowns, then peering behind their trunks, until finally he came to an old Cecil. Ah. Then peering behind their trunks until they finally came to an old sessile oak, its bark overgrown with thick ivy, and there, in the heart of the greenery, he saw a face formed by the arrangement of the fronds. It had only darkness for eyes, and a hole for a mouth, yet a face it undoubtedly was, though it would have been easy for someone to miss. It had not been though it would have been easy for someone to miss it had they not been searching for it. As Jacob watched, the fronds at the mouth moved, and the voice spoke again, a dry whisper, a rustle, like dead leaves driven before the breeze. I was not hiding, said the voice. It was one thing to hide, another not to be noticed. Who are you? Said Jacob. What are you? I suppose one might term me a spirit. Some might even refer to me as a god. But how are you called? Said Jacob. Why, I have many, many names, some of which have never been uttered aloud by men. Today, for you, let me be called but Bonat? Bonat? How would you pronounce this? Is this a real name? Bent coarse grass. I was gonna say Bayonet. Bayonet? Bennett? I would say Bennett. Bayonet. Bayonet? Bayonet it is then, said Jacob, even as he thought that this was a curious name, for it referred to a place of bent grass, of crooked greenery. But then, this was a curious creature, whatever it might be. How long have you been here? He asked. Long enough to have listened to your complaints. Be in it, said Be and not just on this day, but all the days gone by, long enough to feel pity for your plight. Pity, said Jacob. You deserve better. But that is true of many people. What makes it harder for you is that you know you deserve better. A different, richer life is almost within your grasp. If it were granted you, I have no doubt you would cherish it, and value your time on earth all the more. You would no longer waste time pining for what you did not have, because all that you wish for would be yours. You would be content, would you not? I would, said Jacob. The land I farm is good land, but there could be more of it. My wife loves me, but the years, I fear, are not being kind to her. My son is liked by all, but and is a tender soul. But this is not a tender world, and strength will take him further. So what would you have me do? Said Bayonet. If it were in my power to change things for you, you would give me the you would give me the neighbor's land, said Jacob. That might grow more crops and raise more cattle, but not so many acres as to make its stewardship a strain. You would make my wife beautiful once more, but if that were not possible, you would provide me with another who was, but who was, but loved me just as the old wife does. Nevertheless, I would not wish her to be so beautiful that other men might covet her, and would ask that you would provide her with faithful disposition just in case. And you would take my son's kindliness and replace it with a robustness of body and will, but not so much to cause him to reject me in my old age. Then you would be content, said Bayonet. Then I would be content, said Jacob. As he spoke, Jacob believed all he said, but only because he had long before convinced himself the truth of it. Thus a man became a liar while holding himself honest. But what about your neighbor? Said Bayonet. Does he too not value his land? What should become of him if I bequeath his acres to you? I leave that to you, said Jacob, but I wish him no loss. And your wife? What is she to do if another takes her place? I leave that to you, said Jacob, but I wish her happiness. And your son? Should I make him forget his old self? What if he is content as he is? I leave that to you, said Jacob, but I wish him only to be better equipped to face the harshness of life. By now the sun was setting, and it cast a golden glow above Bayonet amid the ivy, so that he seemed to be aflame. And had Jacob not been so enthralled to his own cravings, so bedazzled by the prospect of a better future, he might have perceived that the face of Bayonet was not a benign one, that Bayonet's features were twisted, that Bayonet's mouth was a misshapen scar, and that the concavities of Bayonet's eyes were black, far blacker than any shadows alone should have caused them to appear. Let us be honest with each other, said Bayonet. What you desire is a life that is not the one you have, because it strikes me that it would be most. What you desire is a life that. What you desire is a life that is not the one you have, because it strikes me that you would be most happy if you could have. What? Hold up. What you desire is a life that is not the one you have, because it strikes me that you would be most happy if you could leave your old life behind, shedding it like a skin. Yes, said Jacob, with a confidence he had never felt before. I wish to shed my old life, shed it like a skin. Then I ask that you seal your bargain with blood, said Bayonet, to show I have not misguided the depth of your commitment. Let it drop into my mouth, for I cannot see what you are doing, and only my taste can I confirm that we agreed. So Jacob took his hunting knife, and with a tip he pricked a finger, so that a single droplet of blood fell into Bayonet's mouth. And at that instant, all of the leaves of the tree turned from green to pink, then red. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. This is sounding familiar. And the ivy became flesh, and from the dead wood trunk there emerged a bent, skinless figure, even as the blood continued to drip from Jacob's finger, faster and faster, so that the drops became a stream, and the stream became a torrent, until finally nothing remained of Jacob but his skin and clothes. The crooked man stretched his cramped limbs, and blood stained the dirt, hissing and smoking as it landed. He picked up Jacob's skin and it fit in. He picked up Jacob's skin and fit it to his body, so that he became the image of the dead farmer. The crooked man, you see, was very old. The crooked man, you see, was very old, and very old things may seek to make themselves look young again. For even the worst of us are vanities. Eventually, the crooked man knew his own essence would contaminate Jacob's, and would once again resemble his former self, a gnarled, warped being, although encased in a fresh suit of skin that might last him for many years. But while he favored the dead man, he thought he might take. But while he favored the dead man, he thought he might take advantage of the fact. So the crooked man dressed himself in Jacob's clothing and prepared to make the acquaintance of his new wife. What the f- the and the ivy became flesh, and from the dead wood trunk there emerged a bent, skinless figure, even as the blood continued to drip from Jacob's finger faster and faster, so that the drops became stream, and the stream became a torrent, until finally nothing remained of Jacob but his skin and clothes. The crooked man stretched his cramped limbs, and blood stained the dirt. Skinless figure? While he favored the dead man, he thought he might take advantage of the fact. So the crooked man dressed himself in Jacob's clothing and prepared to make the acquaintance of his new wife. Ceres jerked upright in her chair. The Book of Lost Things had fallen to the floor. Although how long before she could not have said, but the story she had told to her unconscious daughter was fresh in her mind, and she knew it had not come from the book she had been reading. Yet, even this was not quite true, because she sensed that, while it might not have been written in its pages, the tale had come from the same world. The universe of the book, like the ivy at the cottage, was extending its reach into her consciousness, because that was what the books did. She shouldn't have been surprised or frightened. It was just a way of them. Sleep, a dry whisper, a rustle like dead leaves driven before the breeze. And Ceres slept. Whoa, dude. It's kind of like she's reading the book, realizing these things that are happening in the book, and I guess he's just kind of like, because what was happening in the real world in the book is kind of happening to her now, but differently. Better. Man that wanted a better wife. Farm. Son. Vented. In the woods. What if I just sleep schedule them out? That's a good question.
WTF is your sleep schedule, LMAO?
Are you on a train right now, or are you off a train? Also, thank you so much for the resub. 72 months. Ain't that crazy? training. It's so interesting how this book continues from the first book because of the way the first book ends. Just past Kingston. Oh, all right. Right now, Ciri's mother is watching over her comatose child, Phoebe. She's been like that since an accident, car accident. Moved her to a new like hospital, and Siri is reading the Book of Lost Things, which was the book before this book that was written by the character of that book. When Sirius awoke, she saw that someone had eased the chair into the reclined position while she was sleeping and covered her with a blanket. She walked to the window. Dawn was breaking, and she could hear birds chorusing. Despite the efforts of her unknown benefactor to make her more comfortable, her body was stiff. She considered seeking the solace of her own bed, if just for a while, but the memory of the ivy convinced her that it might be less disquieting to remain where she was. Yeah, her house, her cottage, is covered in vines right now. Despite her reading a story, not even reading a story, she just made up a story on the spot about vines. She knew, though, that this was only putting off the inevitable, and eventually she'd have to return and find a way to tackle the invasive greenery. She kept a couple of fresh t-shirts, a change of underwear, and a small toiletry bag in her rucksack. This was one of the first things she learned after Phoebe's accident. It might always be possible to get home after bedside vigil, and any stress would be made worse by having to wear the same clothes 2 or 3 days in a row, or being forced to scavenge or beg for a toothbrush. But what do clothes and toothbrushes matter? She stared down at Phoebe. There were fresh bruises on her daughter's arm from the insertion of new needles and tiny frown lines or pain lines on her forehead that Ceres would not remember having no a Ceres could not remember having noticed before. What does any of it matter? Ceres left the room and made her way, half dazed, to her suite, where she undressed and climbed in the shower. Her legs felt weak, so she sat on the base of the stall and laid her forehead against her arms. The water coursed over her and washed all sense of herself away. The mind and body can only take so much, more than we might imagine or expect, but less on occasion than we might require. We can keep going through force of will, without nourishment, without respite, without support, but only for so long. Ultimately, we must shudder to a halt, and our poor battered selves will seek the chance to rest. Ceres remained slumped in the shower stall, her eyes open but unseeing, the water striking her for so long that it finally became afflictive. She managed to reach up and to turn it off, wrapping herself in a towel, crawling from the bathroom and lying on the bedroom floor. The door to the suite was closed, and no one came to look in on her, assuming that she was resting properly after a night in the chair. Only when the water cooled, causing her to shiver, did Ceres finish drying herself. She dressed automatically, putting on the same clothes she had worn for a day and night, heelless for the fresh ones in the bag. When she was done, she slipped on her shoes and opened the door of the suite, and walked toward the exit of the lantern house. Dimly and distantly, she was aware of voices from the nurse's station, a fuss and bother. But this was not unusual, and she gave it. But this was not unusual, and she gave it no further thought. She just paid no attention to her wet hair. She just paid no attention to her wet hair or the aches in her back, her shoulders and her legs. She was both Ceres and an entity apart, a creature dispensing with all but the most essential function. Manu's consciousness had retreated to a place of safety deep inside. It was enough that she could put on one foot in front of the other, that she could keep moving, but what impelled her to do so, she could not have said. Before her stretched the path leading to the woods, and from a bare branch, the one-eyed rook watched her set one foot upon it, then the other. Why are you going into the woods, Ceres? That was not in the book, but why are you going to the woods? Like a trained raptor following the falconer's glove, the rook glided from tree to tree, always staying marginally ahead of the woman. Ah, the internet. Internet. Woo! Ceres, why are you walking in the woods? The rook glided from tree to tree, always staying marginally ahead of the woman, monitoring her progress, croaking only when she showed signs of faltering. The cry of the bird, harsh and demanding, penetrated the fog that had taken hold of Ceres, dulling the world around her. The rook tipped its beak to what was happening behind her. The forest was closing in on her wake, the branches of the trees reaching out to one another, obscuring the sky, while the roots broke through the earth and formed a barrier of twisted wood from which the earthworms tumbled and beetles fell. But Ceres was not afraid. She did not want to go back, not to a world, paying respects, not to a world in which only the shell of her child was present. Wherever the spirit of Phoebe now dwelt, it was not there. If Ceres was to be restored to herself, if the world was to be made whole again, the part of Phoebe that had been stolen needed to be recovered, and it could not be. And if it could not be. But Ceres did not wish to go on. It was too difficult, and she could not benefit her child only by reading stories to her in the hope that she might hear them and respond, because there was no Phoebe present to react. Ceres could as easily have recited her stories to an empty well, or howled them into the mouth of a cave, for all the good they were doing. More was required of her than that, for something had taken her daughter from her. If she could not make it surrender Phoebe, she would die in the attempt, and that would be for the best. Ceres stood before the old house. Oh, the old house. The house of the author. The author's house. The author of the Book of Lost Things. I don't remember his name. David? Ceres stood before the old house, while behind her the forest became an impenetrable thicket of trunk and branch. She followed the fence until she came to a spot where it had come loose from the pickets and post, and she slipped through the gap. She walked along the verge of the sunken garden, and the place through which David in the book, and who knew in life too, or at the end of it, had entered another realm. I'm just thinking. It's wild. It's wild when 20 years later, mentioning the sunken garden and the house that David lived in. This book was made 20 years later. That's crazy. Anyway. A sign warned against defacing the stonework, but Ceres could see graffiti scrawled and carved on it, left by readers at a time when the property had been more easily accessible. It was the house that was summoning her, behind the window of its uppermost room, the one that had been David's all those years before. She thought she saw a shape pass. It gave her pause, but not long, but not for long. The distant part of her that was observing herself understood that incidents from the book were blending with her own memories, and that she was now seeing what David once saw, or believed he had seen, the crooked man, creeping through these environs, seeking a child. It was not real, yet neither was it altogether unreal. The book had contaminated her, transformed her. It was part of her now, and if it was part of her, might she not also be part of it? It's quite interesting, though, because earlier in the book, when talking about her father when he was alive, would often mention how books change people. That's why he would always tell her to read anything and everything just so you can learn. But it seems like as she kept reading the Book of Lost Things and realizing how similar this feeling of the crooked man taking children away could be, she's seeing the same thing happening to her child that is in this uh, infinite sleep. The rook was circling the eastern side of the house, waiting for her to catch up. The grass was crisp with frost beneath her feet, and she left a trail of footsteps behind, like an echo of the tale of Agath and the crooked man. Confirmation that Ceres had become both story and storyteller, dancer and dance. Another sign by the front door cautioned against trespassing, and advised that the property was under 24-hour surveillance, but she knew from Oliver that this was untrue, and the alarm system had fallen into neglect. She reached the back of the house, managed to get her fingers under the sheet of plywood covering a window, and wrenched it free. One of the panes was already cracked, so she removed the shoe and used the heel to finish the job. The glass tinkling into the kitchen sink within, when she was unsure the square was entirely free of shards. When she was sure the square was entirely free of shards, she put her hand through and turned the latch, then worked the tips of her fingers between the bottom rail and the stay to force the window open. It yielded, but only with some effort on her part, and the painful crackling of a fingernail. She climbed on the ledge, balanced one foot for a moment on the old stone sink on the other side, then eased herself down to the floor. Behind her, the rook alighted on the windowsill, but did not enter. It gave a single croak of what might have been approval before flying off. The kitchen was dusty and cobwebbed, but otherwise neat. Cooking utensils remained hanging on books. The chair was arranged around the table, and the empty fireplace was free of dirt and soot. Ceres discerned the scuttling of mice in the shadows, and was also something larger. A rat, most likely. She wasn't frightened of rats, just wary. They were smart, not as smart as a rook, but clever nonetheless. The sound of them and the throbbing of her broken nail brought her back to herself. She had walked to the house in a kind of daze, but coming out of it, she was aware that she was violating a private space. She wasn't worried about getting into too much trouble. She was sure the hospital would be understanding, but it would still be embarrassing. Her first instinct, therefore, was to leave the way she had entered, yet it was followed by an urge to explore, if only for a few minutes. What was it her father used to say? Might as well be a... Excuse me? Might as well be hanged for a sheep as a lamb. Having gone to the effort of finding a way inside, she should take advantage of the opportunity. Might as well be hanged for a sheep as a lamb. But she also knew this place from the book. Being here was akin to stepping into its pages, so that she would not have been excessively surprised had some spectral David appear before her. A volume under one arm, or the laughter of a newborn carried to her from the floor above. Ceres stepped from the kitchen into the hallway. The stairs to her left. The walls of the house were largely bare. Some of the pictures and photographs that had once graced them have been removed for safekeeping, or even stolen, because she could see the darker patches where they had hung, though more remained in place. She was surprised by how much light there was. The plywood panels over the windows and the front door had not been positioned perfectly flush, and the orientation of the house meant that the morning sunlight shone directly on the front, sending beams through the gaps. In the living room, across from her stood the shrouded forms of furniture, her mind conjuring visions of shapes rising from armchairs and couches, their monstrousness concealed by dust covers. She decided, on reflection, to leave that room undisturbed, and gave her attention to the stairs. There was more light at the top than at the bottom, because the window on the upper floors had not been concealed. By the lowest step was a small glass-topped display case, perhaps from the time when the novel, alongside a selection of items from his wartime childhood, a ration. Wait, I totally skipped a line. By the lowest step was a small glass-topped display case, perhaps from the time when the house had served as a museum. Yeah, okay, there we go. That makes sense, yeah. It contained various editions of David's novel, alongside a selection of items from his wartime childhood. A ration book and ration book supplement from the Ministry of Food, a clothing book in his name, containing unused coupons, an instruction manual titled How to Keep Well in Wartime, and a permit to enter nearby Bletchley Park, the property of David's father. Last of all, there was a photograph of the author with his wife. How much time they enjoyed together before death had separated them. Ceres could remember only that it was too little. The first step creaked loudly as she placed her full weight on it, causing her to pause momentarily. One part of her, the logical part, knew that the house was unoccupied, but another, more primitive Ceres wasn't convinced. She could blame Oliver and his talk of ghosts, but it wasn't his fault alone. After all, not everything described in the book had been invented. The author did come here as a boy, following the loss of his mother. He fought with his stepmother, who gave birth to his half-brother, and incredibly, a German bomber had crashed in the huge garden, and young David, hypnotized by the sight of the burning plane, had almost lost his life as a consequence. When the lines between what was true and untrue became blurred, so also did those between reality and unreality. For a novel to work, it cast a spell on the reader. It didn't have to convince them to believe in the impossible, or cease to distinguish between falsehood and veracity. It's interesting how the character in this book questions what happened in the first book. Because when you're reading the first book, you know it's fiction, but at the end, it's mentioned as if someone actually wrote this book. So how do you believe it was real or not? What was fiction? What was true? I'm sure she would have asked the author if she had known about the book years before, but she kind of like read the book 20 years later. For a novel to work, it had to cast a spell on the reader. It didn't have to convince them to believe in the impossible, or cease to distinguish between falsehood and veracity, but it did require them to lower their defenses, to suspend themselves between realms, even for a time, to forget one world entirely, so engrossed did they become in the other. In this house, Ceres thought the gap between worlds was very narrow. She reached the top of the first flight. All the doors on this level were closed. An arched window, its panes entirely clear and stained, shed multicolored light on the old floorboards. To her right, a narrower set of stairs led to David's attic bedroom. These were completely dark, because this was the only room on the top floor, and its door, too, was shut. Ceres retraced her dreamlike walk to the house, and the shape she thought she had glimpsed by the attic window. Once again, the rational and anti-rational came into conflict. I saw something. I saw nothing. Before reaching a compromise that satisfied neither, which was, she supposed, the definition of compromise. Whatever I saw, it was not what I thought it was, which would have to do. She took the attic stairs cautiously to stand before the door. She didn't know what she would do if she found it locked. So far, she'd broken only a small pane of glass, and that was already damaged. Technically, it was still breaking and entering, but the harm was fairly limited. She wasn't sure she was willing to add destroying lock and cracking the frame of a door to the list of charges. Objectively, what she was doing made no sense. She had entered a house in which she didn't belong, abandoning for a time her catatonic daughter, all because of a book. That is true. Like, you are literally steps away from where this author may or may not, where this author lived in his house, but you're not by your daughter, which you clearly kept mentioning how you do not want to, want her to suffer or have it all end while you're not there. Isn't that also one of the reasons why you've stayed at the Lantern House? But it was too late to undo whatever transformation the narrative had caused in her. Because once read, the story couldn't be unread. She was a different person now, and the book had made her so. Literally what her dad was talking about. Or had it? The tale of the two dancers and the crooked man had come to her before she opened the book. How could she have done that if she were not already acquainted with the book and its contents? Okay, you got me there. Coincidence, then. Writers often had similar ideas, drawing on common human experiences. Falling in love, becoming ill, losing someone dear to them, or on what was happening around them in art, politics, even war. Each writer would make a different narrative from those elements, because no two writers ever looked at the world in precisely the same way. Even if what they create from their personal experiences might be understandable to many. Why should Ceres, the creator of the Book of Lost Things, not have invoked visions of a crooked figure in a crooked hat, playing his crooked games with the unwary? Because she knew this wasn't a different character with a similar name. It was the same figure. Had she somehow been able to sit across from David and prevailed upon him to draw his conception of the crooked man, while she did likewise, they would have produced near similes. Of that she was convinced. Like the devil, she thought. I'd be pretty freaked out reading this book and having the book mention a crooked man and all of a sudden being like, wait, I made up a crooked man description as well. If you ask two people to draw the devil, they'd come up with horns, the legs of a goat, possibly a pointed beard. Images of demons from different cultures often had those details in common, as though each of the artists had, at some point, endured the same nightmare. Perhaps because of the trauma of what had cursed Phoebe, and all that followed from it, the anger and fear, the grief and guilt, Ceres believed that she might have found a way to access some illiterate version of herself, a form of common recall. Distinct cultures shared versions of the same stories, yet it wasn't always clear how this had come to be, because some of those tales predated contact between civilizations. It might be some myths, might be that some myths were so essential to our being, so crucial to our comprehension of the world and our place in it, that we produced them as a matter of course, before passing them on to succeeding generations. Ceres heard her father's voice, like an echo meant only for her ears. These memories teach us what we fear, so we can be aware of them from the moment of our birth. Like certain smells or sounds that we know signal danger. Animals, we think, pass on this capacity, so why not humans? Sound, smells, images. A crooked man. The wind had picked up force outside, coaxing coaxing a litany of moans and groans from the old boards, dislodging rubble from the disused chimneys and sending it tumbling into the grates, and causing pale dust and flakes of paint to descend like snow on Ceres. The locked doors thudded in their frames, and the windows rattled. Down below in the kitchen, a glass or cup, most likely encouraged by a gust through the broken pane, dropped to the floor and shattered. Now the door to the attic room was open before her, not blown ajar, but unfastening slowly, under the control of a careful hand. Ceres stared at what was revealed within, as two worlds started to become one. Bro, hold up. I missed like 2 chapters that I need to write down. First, let me write about uh, uh, tale of a man with ivy. Man wanted a better wife. Farm son vented in the woods. Came upon talking vine. Bionot. Bionot. Man vents. Bionot asks if what he wants will make him content. Yes. Gives blood. Loses blood. All that's left is skin and clothes. Is that all part of one chapter? Did I skip a chapter? What chapter are you on? We're on 11? Oh, shoot. Wait, how are we on chapter 11? Uh, oh, chapter 9 is about. Oh, well. Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah. Chapter 9 is about series leaving cottage due to vines. Uh, what's the word? Due to vines. Uh, 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 growing. Hide the cottage. That's really it, right? Then reads Phoebe. A new story. Chapter 10 is when it goes wild, though. Chapter 10 series. Wakes up, showers, gets dressed, and I guess unknowingly journeys past the woods to David's house. Did they even mention the word David? They just say author. She breaks in. Then realizes where she is. Curiously explores and walks up the stairs. I spelled stairs wrong. The wind howls and attic bedroom opens. Part of me wants to stop because, like, whoa, dude, that's actually crazy. I'll read one more chapter. Is the attic room was filled with ivy. It curled around the bare bedstead and over the bookshelves. An obscure wait, when is this? Is this almost done? Okay, there's 30 minutes left of the rain and thunderstorm. It curled around the bare bedstead and over the bookshelves. It obscured the walls, hunting in reddish green clumps in the empty light fixture, and colonized the floor. And it was moving. A length of it appeared before Siri's face and peered at her. The two topmost leaves at either side of the main stem turning slightly downward in puzzlement, like eyebrows furrowing. Sears looked to her left and saw that another stem was gripping the inner knob tightly, and thus the door had been opened for her. Had been opened to her. Interesting, because of the vines, or the ivy. Amid the vegetation, multicolored insects crawled, hopped, and flew. Sears dodged a white moth with lines of poetry inscribed on its wings, constructed from a single carefully folded page, like a piece of origami coming to life. A large grasshopper landed on the floor by her foot, its body formed from the green and gold boards of a book. Yellow and black striped beetles rushed by, each with a different musical note on its back. When they brushed against one another, they chimed. In the far right-hand corner, a black paper spider, its body as big as Siri's hand, sat at the heart of an intricate arrangement of sticky threads that extended almost to the center of the room. Its length dotted with one-worded flies. And the above rustling, fluttering, and ringing, Sirius heard voices. And above the rustling, fluttering, and ringing, Sirius heard voices, as the dusty, neglected books on the shelves roused themselves to speak. "Who is it?" asked one. "Who's there?" It was coming from a volume on the last battles of the First World War. Sirius saw its closed pages moving like lips, and its tone was suitably clipped and military. I think it's a woman, or a girl," said another. "I can hear her breathing from the tread on the stairs. I believe her to weigh approximately 170 pounds. 140, Ceres countered, affronted, before she even registered that she was arguing with a book. Obviously, she'd taken issue with the contents of the books in the past, but never with the physical object of one. Although she was struggling to establish which books she was actually conversing with, so loud was the babble from the shelves, and so distracting were the bugs and ivy. "Are you absolutely sure? You're only fooling yourself, you know." "Oh, 145, Ceres conceded. "But I'm retaining water." "She's supposed to be here?" asked the military volume. "If she's here," replied the other, "then of course she's supposed to be here. Why would she be here otherwise?" "Don't take that tone with me, young fellow. I'll have you up on the charges. Find out who she is. That's what you do, isn't it? You investigate. What's the point of you otherwise?" After some muttering, which might have included a rude word or two, the second book chimed in. "Excuse me, it said politely. But who are you? Sirius finally traced the source of the question to a copy of Emil and the Detectives. I'm, I'm going mad, she said. Oh, I don't like. Oh, don't be like that, said Emil and the Detectives. It won't help. Yes, said a woman's voice from a book called The Good Master. You found your way, and that's what counts. If you can hear us, it's a sign that you're in the right place. There's no need to be afraid, not yet. Because yeah. Because I'm pretty sure at the end of the first book, this is David basically just lays in bed surrounded by books that he can hear. Or he'd always talked about he could hear the books. Not yet. This came from a much read edition of The Sword in the Stone, its worn covers clinging to its spine by the frailest of threads. His contribution subdued the chattering in the room. We'll have to see, won't we? Said the good master. Now, what is your name, dear? Ceres. There was a murmuring as the name was passed from book to book, although some were clearly rather deaf, and Ceres heard various Phrases and Dorises and Denises being patiently corrected. Are you a child? Asked Emil and the detectives. You don't sound like a child. You sound all grown up. I am grown up, said Ceres, but she didn't feel it, not anymore. Well, that would explain the weight business. Though I still think you ought to have more scales checked. More mutters and more exchanges, a number of them heated. I suspect there's some. I suspect there's been some terrible mistake, said Ceres. You see, I read a book, and it may have been the wrong book. I think it's got into my head, and made it all confuffled. Confuffled. One of her father's words, like "obstinate" instead of accident, and flutterby for butterfly? She hadn't used the word, hadn't heard it spoken aloud since his death. There's no such a thing as a wrong book, said the sword in the stone patiently. There is only one right book, right at the wrong time. Don't bully her, said the good master. Can't you tell she's muddled up? Why have you come here, Ceres? What are you looking for? Ceres thought about the question. She might have been enduring a breakdown, one that was causing her to see sentient ivy evade the plight of insects formed from living paper and hear books speaking. But the peculiar thing, well, the most peculiar thing among many, was that the books were asking sensible questions. Why had she come here? What was she looking for? My daughter is ill, said Ceres. No, it's worse than that. She's gone. Everything I cherished of her has departed, and that's all that's left. And all that's left is a body. It breathes, but it's not Phoebe. Not anymore. Someone robbed me of her, and I want her returned. I speak to her, and I call to her, but she doesn't answer. And it's all so hard that at times I want to give up. It's happening more and more often. That desire to just lie down and never rise again. So that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a way to get my daughter back. Because I can't go on like this. As for what brought me here, it was the book I'm reading. It's made me sick and caused me to see and believe things that aren't real, including all of you. But this is real, said the good master gently. Everything you can imagine is real. You've made it so. This is the story of your life unfolding, and we are part of it, as much as you are. And if you came here looking for your daughter, then listen. It was Emil in the darkness. The good master stopped talking, and the books did. Uh, Listen. It was Emil and the detectives. The good master stopped talking. All the books did although their chattering had been ceaseless until then. Ceaseless until then. There were books speaking to other books, which was what books did, because no book was ever created in isolation. And literature was a long ongoing conversation between stories. The wind had changed again. It was colder, viciously so. The kind of frigidity that doesn't nip or bite. The sound it made was not composed of random gusts, but closer to inhalations and exhalations, and was coming, not from the outside, but from the attic room itself, from the walls, the room, and the floor. What is it? Asked Ceres. Now, said the sword and the stone, it's time to be afraid. You have to get out here, Ceres, said the good master. Be quick, but be very, very quiet. If you make too much noise, it will hear you. It mustn't hear you. Ceres backed out of the room, and the ivy closed the door soundlessly behind her. She wanted to run, but she knew that if she did, it would be noticed, and the warning of the good master had not fallen on deaf ears. So she stood on the topmost step, one hand on the banister, the other against the wall. She tried to remain as immobile as possible. Behind the door, the wind reached a crescendo before dropping entirely, only to be replaced by the shifting of leaves, as though someone or something were making their way through the vegetation within. Ceres crouched until she was level with the empty keyhole. She peered through the gap and saw the Ceres crouched until she was level with the keyhole. She peered through the gap and saw the ivy was in motion, composing itself into a single mass in the center of the room. Two holes appeared in, within a third large gap below, with a suggestion of a nose between. Ceres was looking at a face, which now turned left and right, seeking, scowling. A paper mouth flitted in front of it, A paper moth flitted in front of it, startled into flight, and two coils of ivy shot from the green mouth and ripped the insects to shreds. The moths remained drifted to the floor, even as the ivy extended farther beyond Ceres' sight. When the coils became visible again, they were holding a book between them, and Ceres recognized it as the Good Master. The green mouth moved, and a sing-song voice came from its lips. One purposed only for the mockery of and malice. I heard you speak, book, it said. But to whom? To my brother and sisters, said the good master, as I always do. Only the slightest tremble in the book's speech gave its fear away. Not as you have always done, said the face of ivy. I know the tone and patterns of each and every one of you. So long have I been listening to your prating, but another voice was heard, one that I did not recognize. Are you suggesting a new book has been added to your number? If so, show it to me. Tell me who brought it and why. You are mistaken, said the good master. It is only what you see on the shelves, just as it has been many years. The eyes in the greenery narrowed. You know better than to lie to me. To you? Said the good master, summoning defiance. But we do not even know who you are. We often felt you circling, and sometimes I've heard you pass like a breeze through the ivy, but you are not familiar to us. Oh, but I am familiar, for my spirit is in each of you. You really ought to have paid closer attention. The good master did not answer immediately, but when it did, fear was back. Ceres thought it did recognize the apparition after all, and not newly either, though it persisted with its denials. Whatever you are, we have no need of you, the good master said. Here are the worlds upon worlds, so many in places. Here are the worlds upon worlds, so many people, places, ideas. That is enough for us. We require no more. Another lie, said the face of Ivy. You require a reader. What is a book if it is not read? I will tell you, nothing. It is not a voice alone that drew me. I sensed your excitement, your joy. No new book, however. No new book, however wonderful, could have aroused such feelings. You gave yourselves away in your desire to be read, and only the arrival of a person could have caused that. Now I will ask you again, to whom were you speaking? This is foolishness, said the good master. But leave us be. We'll not have discourse with some wraith, an itinerant? Itinerant. The act of traveling from place to place. Traveling from place to place, especially as a circuit minister. Oh, okay, because he moves a lot. Traveling a lot. Who will not have a discourse with some wraith, an itinerant phantom that has to borrow leaf and branch to give structure to itself. So be it, said the face. More ivy encircled the good master, gripping its pages and boards wide, opening it wide. Goodbye, book. And the good master was torn apart, just as the moth had been, the ivy reducing it to shreds of paper and scraps of cloth. Sirius heard the book cry out, but only at the start. Once its spine had been broken, it was finished. And after that, the end came fast. Now the ivy went hunting again, returning with another volume, this time Emil and the detectives. Whatever the entity was, it could indeed identify the individual voice of every book. Soon it would be the turn of the military history and the stone and the sword. The sword and the stone. What about you, boy? Said the face of the ivy. I fancy you'll be more sensible. If not, I will take my time with you, page by page, and I promise that you'll tell me everything you know before we're done. But I don't want to destroy you, you see. I like stories, so why would I take pleasure in destroying one? Let me make it easier for you. I know it was a woman who came here. I should like you to tell me her name. Will you do that, boy? Just a name, you see. I've been waiting for a woman, a very particular woman. You could say that I've been calling to her. She's important, very important than you can imagine. But I don't wish her to, but I don't wish her any harm. Precisely the opposite. I want to help her. Slowly the ivy began to tear the title page of Emil in the darkness. The book wailed with the voice of a child, and Sirius could bear it no longer. Stop! Leave them alone! The door was wrenched open, and the dreadful face stared out in triumph. Ivy sped across the floor, reaching for her as Ivy sped across the floor, reaching for her, as from the shelves a chorus of books shouted a single word in unison, "Run!" And Sirius ran. What the hell, dude? It's not the Crooked Man, but it's like an Ivy? Or maybe it is the Crooked Man. 11. in the room. Bugs talking. Books. Asked who she was and why she was here. Told her to hide or leave, for it was coming. Ivy. Up and demanded answers. Broke, or I guess teared up the good master. And threatened uh the male detectives. Series stopped the ivy. Been watching her, knows about her, but doesn't know the name. The Hunting Game. Chapter 12. The Hunting Game. Sirius took the attic stairs two at a time, and only as she reached the main flight did she take a moment to check on the pursuit. Ivy was rapidly covering the walls and ceiling and twisting around the banister rails, its lengths now studded with barbs, their points tinged with red like blood-dipped thorns. With it came the face from the attic, reconstituting itself over and over, advancing to lead the hunt from among the foremost fronds. A slight hesitation was enough to earn Ceres a nick on the ankle from a branch that had outpaced the rest, but was also served to spur her on. Before her was the front door, but there was no escape that way, even if she could have opened it. A steel plate waited. No, she would have to leave as she had entered, which meant getting to the kitchen and clambering through the window. It was now darker downstairs than she remembered. Slowly, the beams of sunlight shining through the gaps in the panels were being smothered, and Ceres could hear movement on the floor. She pictured ivy pouring forth from the attic window, gradually enveloping the entire house. When it was done, she would be trapped inside, sequestered with a creature of venture and verger, verger. Huh. The greenness and growing vegetation. Ah. When it was done, she would be trapped inside, sequestered with a creature of verdure and hate. And it would do to her what it had done to the good master. It would seize her, torment her, and rip her apart. Ceres turned sharply on the last step and skidded on the boards, almost falling before she found her balance. Another branch flicked at her right hand, cutting into the soft flesh between her thumb and index finger. Ah, that hurts, dude. I don't like that. But the kitchen door was ahead of her, and Siri could see the light. It made sense. If the ivy was using the attic window to gain access to the exterior of the house, this would be one of the last places it reached. Beyond the window was open ground, and Sears could run fast when the need arose. Once she was outside, she'd outstrip the ivy and whatever was animating it. From there, she'd be in a race to the lantern house in safety. If the forest remained impassable, she'd have to work her way around it, but she'd deal with the problem when she came to it. Sirius entered the kitchen, sunlight blessed shining on through the obscured glass. But even as she drew nearer, the ivy outside crept over the window, and the room was plunged into shadow. Only the visible light was coming from the door. The only visible light was coming from under the door. Wait, what? Sirius entered the kitchen, sunlight blessedly shining on through the obscured glass. But even as she drew nearer, the ivy outside crept over the window, and the room was plunged into shadow. The only visible light was coming from under the door. Please, whispered Ceres. Please. She turned the handle as the first fingers of ivy grasped the head of the kitchen entrance. The back door was locked and swollen in its frame, but Ceres could see that the wood was rotten and would not withstand much pressure. She yanked hard, bracing herself against the wall with her left foot, and the door came free. Behind it was a plywood panel, not steel as the front door of the house. Ceres charged it once and then twice. Then the screws started to come away as the ivy invaded the kitchen in earnest. She took a step back, ignoring the pain as another barb sliced her left calf and hurled her body full force at the plywood. It broke free, Ceres' momentum carrying her forward so that she was sent sprawling into the ground, belly flopping painfully on the dirt as the wind was knocked from her. Her face followed through to strike the ground. And she felt her nose crunch. The shock of the impact left her stunned, but she managed to get to her feet, ready to start running again despite the pain, ready to leave the house behind forever. But when she looked back, the house was gone. What the? What? Bruh, what is happening? I just want to see how long the next chapter is. Okay, like 2 pages. So she escaped. She escaped through the kitchen door. Or if that's what's happening, right? Yeah. And she came through the kitchen door. She escaped through the kitchen door. That's what I should have said. Rushed out the attic room and down the stairs as Ivy kept slashing her flesh. Escapes through boarded up kitchen door. House was gone. Ceres was standing, not on an overgrown lawn, but in dense woodland. The trees so high that the crowns were lost to low cloud, and the trunks so thick that 5 men could not have enclosed their circumference with linked arms. The bark of the tree near Ceres had been mutilated by a wound that stretched from the forest floor to the bark of the trees near Ceres had been mutilated by a wound that stretched from the forest floor to the level of her head, leaking viscous sap. But as Ceres stared, the hole started to close, and she grasped that this was how she had arrived. Somehow she had run through the doorway of the house and come out of the way, and come out by the way of a tree trunk. The good news was that she was no longer being pursued by ivy or anything else. The bad news was she had no idea where she might be. But whatever it wasn't where she wasn't supposed to be, which was close to the lantern house and to Phoebe. Nah, I'm ending it there. Dude. Ah! Ah! Actually getting to the really good part. I might freaking yeet myself. Let's sit. Let me sit. Ah. Okay, so basically she is in a new world. She got freaking isekai'd to the goddamn tree. Just like David. I think what's interesting, I'm gonna note it down. I think what's interesting of it all is how I was about to say David's father. No. What's interesting is the fact that Siri's father mentioned how books can change people. And yet, David's book was Indeed. Changing series. But she did see, she did have mention of Crooked Man in her story before even reading the book. I'd be pretty freaking terrified, dude. Very terrified. That's crazy. That's a crazy. This book is crazy. It blows my mind how it mentions that. I still wouldn't say blows my mind, but it's like, where is it? Wait, I think it is this page. Talking about dodecahedron. These are definitely things I'm gonna have to remember. Or I won't say keep notes, but it's like they're gonna happen and continue. When when does David get transported into the other world? I don't think it definitely isn't 67 pages in the first book. But it's kind of like you want to establish this person um first. It, I guess it's cuz like it's one thing for we learn that David is it's one thing learning that David is basically, depressed for because of his stepmother and half brother and all that. But where he just kind of, you know, hides himself away with books. Here, it's kind of the opposite because instead of a child, we're seeing an adult whose whose daughter basically lost. I'm assuming the crooked man has her soul or spirit. How many pages are there? 300? It's not bad. I wonder if series will come across. Well, it's not the same world, right? It can't be. The significance of the first book being called the Book of Lost Things is because all the things that David lost and forgot, the crooked man had, and the more he kept him, the longer like he would forget who he is. Everyone would forget him. Also, like the good things. I'm pretty sure it was like the good things he remembered and cherished were gone in that book. Would the land of lost things be because of land of lost things be because of the world or something specific? Maybe the land her is her childhood like place growing up. I don't know. Anyway, I really want to continue reading, but it's like I want to pace myself. I want to read all of it at once. It's a really good book. Where is the page? I want to find that page where her father mentions books changing people. The story became part of the world, and anyone who heard it or read it, to whom it took root, was never the same again. Am I saying this word properly? Yeah, benign. Pour venom into a book, or warp truth sufficiently in its pages, and you could turn a weak mind hateful. But the more one read, and the wider one's reading, the stronger. It's not the people who read books you have to worry about, but the people who don't. Once a book or story was told for the first time, reality itself shifted. The story became part of the world, and anyone who heard it or read it, and in whom it took root, was never the same again. Stories were a benign infection, transforming their host or generally benign, because some books could reshape people for the worse. But the more one But the more one read, and the wider one's reading, the stronger one's mind became. I'll be back later. Bye bye. Thank you again for the gift, my dude.